Hi YouTubers, and thank you for tuning into today's very different video on YouTube. I was looking like a jump scare. And yes, I'm going to be doing something very totally different. And it's going to be mainly in the form of Google Trends, which is something that I don't often use. But in this video, I'm going to be determining on different search terms of certain interests of certain TV franchises, in particular those built for children and also toys, or like different toy brands, which is actually fairly interesting to know. And yes, this video is going to be mainly referring to like search terms instead of what I'm actually going to be saying here as I'm jump cutting this video. And yes, in this video, just as a bit of a very big disclaimer here, this video is more to do with a certain period of time of whatever term I'm putting up onto Google Trends rather than anything else. And yes, this video, in relationship to nothing else, has nothing to do with the sales in relationship to the toys. Toys and sales like that, of course, eh? Let's go ahead and take a look at what I'm going to be looking at in this video. Okay, the first franchise I'm going to kick off is, of course, Thomas the Tank Engine. And, of course, I did another search trend of that as well, too, which is relating to the same entity and the same franchise itself, of course, eh? So, as I'm talking roughly and ready here, as I'm looking over the charts data of the Google Trends topic that I'm in, you can see why the franchise has started to pretty much increase over the past because, the franchise was relatively good by many fans alike. Then the franchise started to slump as time went on, and you can see why that the franchise was starting to get a little bit deep and dark. But then, of course, I've noticed those little bubbles that hint around December. Now, apart from those little hints, I can definitely see the decay of what the franchise was definitely up to. Somehow, that's very much something I've been very curious of. Is it really a possible indicator of how popular and unpopular a franchise has been over its enduring period of time, or long-lasting time, of course? And seeing this decay has made me very theoretically shocked in a sense. And seeing this decay of Thomas the Tank Engine has actually made me feel relatively tragically disappointed. And overall, it was one of my favourite childhood franchises of all time, as monotonous as it sounds. And you can see why that the trend has started to decay over a very prolonged period of time. And seeing this decay has made us, well, fans, and probably people in the autistic spectrum, really disappointed. And I'm pretty sure that we don't really know what's caused this decay. Is it probably because of Mattel owning the franchise and then, making the franchise good again? I mean, what's your thoughts about the franchise when Mattel first owned the Thomas and Friends franchise that started around, 2010 to 2011? I can really go ahead and talk about that later on, but let's move on to the Nerf guns. Obviously, it was very big, where it wasn't at first glance over the first decade. It was first initiated by Google Trends, but then as you start to see, I can see a bubble that really relates a very big key peak indicator around December of every year. It happens every year, doesn't it? Lego also follows the same trend in this. You can see those bubble trends start to be very consistent and uniform, and you can see the formality over these trend charts as time went by. Hot Wheels, of course, same performance, of course, as others. But then when I look at it as a YouTube search, it looks so different to what I'd mainly find as a web search. And you can see why the web search actually has a much more consistent feature when I look at it throughout the rest of its lifetime. And there's a couple of vans driving away on the other side of the background. Obviously, you can see why the toy franchise started to peak around December, as uniform as this sounds and consistent it is. But if I take a look at it as a YouTube search, you can see why it's becoming relatively different. Now, I can see peaks in July. Some peaks can also occur at the same time as around December. But yeah, what was very funny was that even if the franchise was relatively popular years back then, I'm strangely shocked to see why the franchise has decided to become a worldwide phenomenon in the year of 2021. It's kind of strange, isn't it? I don't know why Hot Wheels had to be very, very, very overrated at that time. My Little Pony, that was one franchise that bolted through the stables over the G4 incarnation of the franchise, and then started to sort of went back into this, sort of gallop all the way back to the stables as the fourth generation ended, and then as the fifth generation started to peak, and especially those who are connected into like TikTok, the fifth generation started to reinvigorate and reimburse the franchise over a very short time. Although that being said, I can see what Google Trends has seen a very shocking trend, and the decay of the franchise has seen it completely better days. And sorry, there's a little bit of saliva here. It has seen it completely better days, obviously, of course. Sorry, there's a bit of neighborhood going on here, which shouldn't be allowed here. Let me just close the window here. Okay, this looks quite completely like a complete freak show. I've just closed the window here. I mind you, the nights are getting shorter, because it's springtime and then we're getting into summer. So yes, the franchise was looking very relatively different. Peppa Pig was one franchise that can look back, it just pretty much crawled out of the mud hole and then went back into the mud hole at some period of time, and it sort of, peaked again, but then it sort of slumped after that, which is kind of very much obvious for many kids franchises over a very long basis and a period of time. But if I look at Lightning McQueen, you can see why the franchise was very much uniform and consistent, especially when the movies started to come out. I think the peaks happened when a new Cars franchise movie started to peak through as years went by, and then they started to slump down, but then those peaks started to indicate throughout the spring and the summer months, and also probably around Christmas time. That's when you start to collect Lightning McQueen toys, which is pretty much obvious somehow. Of course, there's Paw Patrol. Obviously, that has been a very consistent franchise. It wasn't really big at the start and years ago, but then when you crawl up towards later years, you can see why Paw Patrol started to have a massive peak in 2016 and then started to peak again. It then it started to slump away, but then had a very slumped down uniform consistency of the trends. And I bet that trend there, right behind Lum, overall, has been very much obvious in a sense, considering that this peak here was very responsible because of the Paw Patrol movies that it came out in both 2023 and 2021. But there's one other doggy franchise which is even much more better. It's Bluey. Keep an eye out on Bluey and you can see why this franchise has been very consistent, and you can see why it has done a ton of awesome jobs so far. A ton for amount of jobs, which has been relatively awesome, even though it's a relatively newish franchise. Keep an eye on Bluey. It's been very relatively popular in the UK, but if I go ahead and land over to its native country, Australia, then you start to see why the hell it has become such a very popular trend, and you start to see why those trend peaks have made it a very popular franchise. I mean, it's a little bit uniform to say that, but hey, somehow that's how trends work. Okay, let me just go ahead and take a look at the United Kingdom over the Bluey franchise, which I'm quite curious about. And you can see why the Bluey franchise has started to skyrocket high, considering I might probably type in some honorable mentions like the Barbie franchise, considering that movie was skyrocketing high in terms of how it was pretty much being treated as a franchise that has shown its resilience and relevance, existing relevance. It's proving long-lasting relevance. Very interesting, somehow, when I look at different franchises, of course. But going back to Thomas the Tank Engine and another term of Thomas and Friends, and what's very interesting is, yes, I can see the same syndrome, but we've seen a very huge inconsistency. I think this is mainly referring to the character, or both the franchise and the character. But if I look at the whole franchise itself, yes, it then started to have a very nasty slump at somewhere in August 2004, but then it started to peak through. But then what was very strange was, as time went on, in somewhere in the late 2010, let's say 2000s, I think, in the early 2010s, the Thomas and Friends franchise started to see a decay of what was going on here, and that was also the time when Mattel started to purchase and buy the franchise. Now, I want you guys really want to tell you, like, the audience will possibly have to tell me, and the Thomas fans alike here, like, Mattel has clearly bought a franchise that was dying and sort of running out of steam and was about to derail for the sake of it not being so popular anymore. Why the hell has that really happened? And yes, as I look over the data between Thomas the Tank Engine and Thomas and Friends, by looking at the Google database, it's looking very tragic. Now, of course, yes, it was very interesting that Mattel decided to purchase a dying brand and would have possibly helped the franchise to actually get back on the rails. Now, I want the audience, as I said again, to obviously possibly tell me about, how would you feel about that? How does that make you feel about the franchise being reinvigorated by a very large toy brand responsible for both Hot Wheels and Barbie toys? And that's very much one thing I can really say here. Often this very interesting chart here often pretty much indicates a certain thing. Maybe if I go back to 2020, and what really happened 4 years ago was pretty much the massive supply chain. I think there was a shortage of different toys that you had to purchase during I don't know what it was, maybe during Christmas time or your normal day lifestyle. I don't know. It is interesting somehow with, the COVID-19 pandemic, basically slumping over different sales of different toys and whatnot. And seeing that dying, decaying factor in the slump part of 2010 to 2011 has made me queerize that as Mattel has basically done a very good and positive feedback to the franchise and make Thomas and Friends a very good franchise as it was, as always. And yes, as I'm saying this for the third time, I want the audience to possibly tell me about this. And seeing this very huge inconsistency of the Thomas and Friends franchise, which is one of my favorite childhood brands of all time, has made me start to scratch my head. Has the Thomas and Friends franchise just basically, just gone derailed off? Maybe, I don't know what to really say. Well, one thing I could probably indicate to me is probably when 2010 was the year when the iPad generation came out and probably led to a whole bunch of toy sales being slumped over in favor of the iPad and tablets like this in front of me. Or is it possibly a franchise that has been just deemed to run out of steam and is now stuck in a branch line all the way to extinction? I want you guys to basically tell me about that. Because, hey, theories like that can pretty much spark confusion and delay into a dilemma that I'll never will pretty much face upon. And I'm sort of thinking, what exactly happened to Thomas the Tank or Thomas and Friends back in 2010 and 2011 that has caused this franchise to basically derail off the tracks? And sorry for the pun here, as obvious as this sounds. And I'm sure the whole of the Thomas and Friends audience who are watching this video will help me to probably explain what has caused this massive downfall, as obvious as this sounds. And thinking I could probably put up with other characters, like I could definitely do a battle against, with Thomas the Tank Engine and Percy the Small Engine. Well, we're starting to see a very different trend over a period of time. And I'm actually going to fix the letters here, so that, I'm just going to, oh, sorry, that's my bad. I just don't want it very consistent, hey? Percy the Small Engine. Flippin' hell. Okay, so yes, you can definitely see why Thomas the Tank Engine is certainly, basically, very much in supreme popularity. But with the Percy fans, that's pretty much bad, isn't it, though? Oh my god. And yes, it does seem to look like that Percy the Small Engine doesn't seem to rank the notch of Thomas the Tank. But we never know why, didn't we? I think it's pretty much left the toy company behind. And yes, like I said, as early as this sounds on my YouTube videos of late, which is the one I'm making here. Oops, sorry, this is an archived image from another video, of course. This video is mainly, of course, talking about different terms of search which have been pretty much in interest over time and not pretty much relating to the sales of the toys. Yes, this has nothing to do with what I've just said so far of this video of late. And yes, if I look at certain franchises like Bob the Builder, I did type in Bob the Builder because I know that the original franchise was relatively good, but then when the reboot came out, was it an absolute flop? And yes, people did say to me, yes, it was an absolute flop and a total failure. And I think a couple of years ago, I would have actually seen a few Bob the Builder themed toys being released at a very short period of time before the franchise just went extinct or just went into bust. And seeing that just really sort of cracks me up. Well, not really in a sense though, because it really is a great indicator of how things are popular and not so popular these days. It really is quite shocking going from the start to the end. With peaks in one year and droughts in another. And just going back to the Hot Wheels trend that I just spoke earlier before, sometimes a bubble mid-year and then another bubble around in December. But let's take a look at Airfix, which I think has done a very good job. I think it's one of those toys where you just build models of aircraft and you've got like the little kits that you make, I think. And maybe I can add Tonka toys. Maybe I could probably add that as a little comparison to see how two of these toy brands would have actually competed for the sake of marketing purposes. And yes, as I'm seeing this comparison contains both search terms and topics which are measured differently, and you can see why Tonka Toys hasn't really been performing that much compared to like Airfix, which is interesting. But then if I go ahead and close Airfix and look at Tonka Toys, and strangely enough, maybe I can just copy and paste that and just do that, of course, because I want to just take a look at Tonka Toys, only just Tonka Toys, for the sake of how popular it is. And I'm quite curious on how popular or unpopular the brand is. Well, I'm not seeing how popular it is, I'm afraid. Oh, it's a YouTube search. Sorry about that. If I type in a web search, it is... Oh, man, what the hell was I doing? Flippin' now, I think this video has basically gone off the rails. Here we go. There you go. It's a web search and not a YouTube search. And if I compare it with Airfix... Oh my goodness me. And yes, who knows? I'm just pretty much giving the toy companies the boot, or giving toy companies the rope. Just to see what the hell is going on here. I mean, look at Airfix. Look how big the peak on Airfix is. But if I look at, Tonka Toys, that's very much a slump. And if I go ahead and take a look at Airfix, you can see how very remarkably uniform that trend it really has. I mean, that is amazing. I mean, look at the trend on Airfix. Blooming hell. If I look at Tonka Toys again, and I'm doing it very repetitively because I'm just studying about on how toy brands used to get so popular. Now they're just a dying era for them. It really has me shaking my head to say, how the hell am I really going to make a very popular franchise, a popular franchise that is appealing to both children and adults in different formats, I guess. One thing that really has sparked a very huge factor on my brain, when I thought of the pandemic and the supply chain that has been busted, it really has been very much became not sort of an unusual factor these days. And it seems like then when, toy stock sales have been slumped over, I'm seeing like the empty peg syndrome and the empty shelf syndrome that I'm actually on about. It's these sort of things where I just, straightforward think to myself, what really happened during the pandemic? When the factories started to close down in China, well then the kids will get nothing for Christmas, but just rather like a bunch of coal. I mean, that's something I'd probably say somehow, But hey, that was what 2020 was about. Everyone had to stay indoors, and it was a complete year that no one really wanted to talk about. But hey, somehow that was very much really reflective in the way I felt. What a complete strange year. And, a lot of toys, the supply chain would have been busted by that time. That was crazy. Flipping hell. And I mean, apart from the Thomas and Friends franchise just being like off the boil, and I mean with the chronic panic buying things that were happening in the pandemic, that really has sort of retrospectively think to myself, have I really walked away from the franchise? Maybe, but I don't know. It's still kind of weird. what I'm not actually seeing with the Google Trends factor that I've decided to implement in this video is the comparison between Thomas and Friends and Paw Patrol. That's very interesting to see because it's quite a very huge contrast. I mean, look at that. Blooming hell. It's very interesting that it's pretty much a great indicator into which a franchise, you have one franchise that has been popular but then has started to die and decay, and then when you've got the other one, which is the red line here, you start to realize on how popular the franchise has been. So it really indicates a complete convergence on how the franchises meet each other and then exchange that popularity in favor of the other brand to become the most dominant and the most popular brand designated and designed for children. It really is mind-boggling, to possibly say the least. And looking back to the Thomas and Friends franchise, and I'm sort of thinking about this huge decline back in 2010, and it really is sort of, straightforward off the boil, which really is quite shocking. And if I go back to the United Kingdom, which is the place that I live in now, I can definitely see why the hell the franchise must have been off the rails. And of course, yes, as I said before with 2010, of course, yes, there were other things. Maybe there was this drift away from the island of Sodor. The Thomas and Friends franchise just started to drift away from the island of Sodor with, there was a DVD called Misty Island Rescue. You can take a look at that. And then, of course, there was, the iPad generation. It was the iPad Christmas. Now, that was the big thing at that time, when, I was one of these people. It took me over at least around 10 years to get into the iPad generation, and it seems like that I'm one of these people who would have spent most of the time on screens. Fantastic to hear, but hey, that was pretty much nostalgia, somehow. Well, I hope you really enjoyed in this very obscure and very strange analytic data within Google Trends, and it's one of these sort of videos where I actually thought I really didn't want to make it because, hey, it mainly contained a whole bunch of childrenal stuff, which is something that I'm not really always geared into. And with the way I've decided to probably pop up these little franchises here has maybe sort of retrospectively astonished me and also sort of disappointed me onto how those analyzations has straightforward resulted. It's really shocking, isn't it? Anyways, I shall probably leave this video here without having my throat being lost overall, without the constant talking throughout the rest of the day. So please give this video a like, subscribe for more flat videos in the future. And it really is a great indicator to see if a toy franchise has died off or anything else in general that has been popular at that time but then has died off, and then maybe when that toy franchise has died off, it may start to come back and retrend for the sake of it being popular again. Now, it is interesting, isn't it? Google Trends, a wonderful app, and I'm sure that, as I said before, there are more people who could probably use that kind of thing on the internet rather than me. As always, thank you so much for watching. And I'm really sorry I had to take so long to produce this video. It was a very dedicated and very interesting video to look at. Again, thank you and goodbye.